Well, good morning. I'd like to thank Mike for the invite. This is one of the, or at least my first opportunity to come down here and speak to you all, and this is usually somewhat of a different kind of audience that I'm accustomed to, being a federal employee doing fishery regulation. Normally it's more of a, say, hostile environment where you're actually telling somebody what you can or cannot do, and then they tell you how much they love you. So what I tried to do this morning is take a slightly different approach and kind of skip across the surface of some of the aspects of the Atlantic bluefin tuna, whether it be regulation, biology, technology, innovation, migratory patterns. So I'm really gonna kind of hit a number of different aspects, but not get too deep in any of them in particular. And then what I'm more comfortable with is more of that QA, QC. So I'll try to make sure that there's plenty of time, so if there are any thoughts that you all have, things you've heard in the media, just whatever it may be, we can kind of talk about those in more of a discussion format. So essentially, you know, who's this guy up on stage talking to? So my name's Brad McHale, New Englander through and through, and from a very young age, just like Chris mentioned in the previous, got hooked very early on with that first fish. I think mine happened to be a pumpkin seed, you know, that once you knew it, you knew it. But what I also then quickly come to realize is that well, I'm not that good at it. You know, so this is, you know, a couple photos of fish I've caught over the years, but definitely was not good enough at fishing to make a livelihood out of it, doing it commercially. Definitely wasn't good enough to do it recreationally that folks would then pay me to take them. So went to the University of Rhode Island, got my marine affairs degree, and tried to figure out, well, I really enjoyed the science, but wasn't quite smart enough to go that full route. So let me go to the politics side of things, much easier. So then you actually got exposed to talk to the scientists about where their passions resided. You talk to the fishermen, and then you're the guy in the middle. So you're kind of exposed to a lot of different fronts. So the group I work for, we are part of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, but the group is actually the National Marine Fisheries Service, and I am part of the Atlantic Highly Migratory Species Management Division. So we're tasked with the stewardship of managing tunas, sharks, swordfish, and billfish, and kind of all the other various species that kind of fall underneath those complexes. The fish that I primarily focus on are more the Atlantic tunas, and more in particular, the Atlantic bluefin tuna, a highly, you know, high-profile fish, highly regulated, both internationally, domestically, but has some very unique characteristics regarding its biology, some of the management history, and then I'll kind of get into some of the specifics of how your tax dollars are actually being spent to make sure that some of these fish are out there for your grandchildren and their grandchildren and so forth. So a little bit about the biology. So I think Chris stole one of my lines in the previous, is that these fish can become extremely large. You know, they can be 1,500 pounds, and sometimes even just slightly north of that. They genuinely look like a VW bug when they come up out of the water and happen to be on deck. They are the only bony fish, and I'm sure there could be an ichthyologist or a biologist that may correct me, but I believe they're the only bony fish, now excluding sharks, that actually are known to regulate their body temperature and some of the heat exchange. I don't know if Toby in the great white shark discussion may touch on that or not, but essentially what this allows these fish to do is have a very high metabolism, operate in cold waters, and really become a voracious predator. And working with some of my other colleagues from the Massachusetts Department or Division of Marine Fisheries, when they've done stomach contents, you name it, it's in the belly of these fish, whether it's dogfish, tautog, lobsters, I don't know if they have monkey dung down here, but it's a sponge. So anything from what you would expect, the menhaden, the herring, if it's in front of them, they're hungry, they're gonna eat it, and they're constantly eating. And they also given, the science date are long-lived. They could be upwards of 40 years. There's a little bit of back and forth, like always with science, of what assumptions do you make to get to that point, and how do you actually, age an otolith, if you will, but extremely long-lived animals. So, it's kind of in the name of the title of my division, the highly migratory species. So one other kind of attribute that, again, Chris touched on in the previous one is that they are widely distributed. Now, I'm focusing primarily just here on the Atlantic, but they're global. There's Pacific bluefin, there's Indian Ocean. But for today's discussion, we're focusing primarily on the Atlantic. And currently, there are really two kind of acknowledged spawning areas for bluefin tuna. One happens to be in the Gulf of Mexico, and the other in the Mediterranean. There were some recent discoveries on a trawl survey that actually happened to do some, in some downtime, they just put over some bongo nets that essentially harvest larvae. And they found a number of larvae just off the coast of Long Island and southern New England, and these larvae were days old. And so obviously that begs the question of, okay, well, if they're days old, did they come from the Gulf of Mexico? Because that's a long way to journey, even in the Gulf Stream, so that isn't possible. So there's always new discoveries with this particular species, although it has been studied, continues to be studied. We're still, discovering more and more stuff each and every year. In regards to some of the migratory patterns, this dotted line here, and I'll speak to that a little bit, man-made, it essentially was a fabrication of how do you manage this species when it has this much of a geographic range and you have all these various countries that have an interest in this natural resource, hence why a fish without a country. It's not a fish that's going to stay in Shinnecock Bay. It's not just going to stay in the Gulf of Maine. They can be, say, off the coast of Long Island here, and then within a month later, bang, up off Norway or off Ireland. And some of our tagging studies have shown that these fish can migrate that quickly. But yet, some of these fish then, within a year or two later, come back and can be caught within a mile where they were originally tagged. So there's still a lot of information we're continuing to try to understand about these migratory patterns and how they move and how do they school together, where some fish will be tagged in the same school, but they don't go anywhere near each other for the rest of their lives. And so there's some interesting aspects to that. As well as some of those aspects are how these fish that are spawned in the Gulf of Mexico, or say the Mediterranean, where did they go? And it was a common understanding that the fish that were spawned in the Gulf of Mexico stayed along the eastern seaboard. And the fish that were spawned in the Mediterranean stayed in the Med and then along the eastern Atlantic. Well, as newer scientific techniques have come to light to be able to determine, based upon some chemical analyses of where these fish are spawned, it shows that there's much more exchange rate of fish moving across the Atlantic and then hang out in different waters. So the fish, say, that we're catching here recreationally or even commercially, we think, oh, they're quote unquote our fish, they're here in the West. They were born here in the West. Is not always the case. And the ripple effects that can have on science when you're doing, say, stock assessments and trying to determine how many are out there and, are there enough to continue to spawn and grow the population and rebuild the population, that has become a huge sticking point of how do you then fold that into your stock assessment models to factor in what is that mixing rate, and then ultimately how does that impact the results you get from those assessments. So this is kind of a cartoon. It's where's Waldo? But essentially this is kind of my daily life. Is I got to make everybody here happy. The fish, the fishermen, all the various uses. And needless to say that sometimes that is not an easy task. In fact, you can't make everybody happy. You actually, in a I take this approach to heart, I have to piss them all off equally. Because you can't make everybody happy. But if you make everyone upset, they're not upset because they're just as upset as the guy next to them. And so usually you can find some common ground in those aspects. But the number of interested parties that are in this is because, although you don't see them too much in advertising, Charlie these days, and the world is out to get them. I think we've all seen it, whether it be in press, documentaries, television shows, depending on how interested you are, different assessment papers, is that the amount of pressure placed on this species once it went from, say, a commodity back in the 50s where essentially they were caught and used for cat food, where all of a sudden the price went up, technology changed where now you could freeze this product. The demand in Japan went up exponentially, where all of a sudden you weren't a sushi establishment unless you could offer bluefin tuna. And all the quality bluefin tuna went to Japan. And so whether flights going directly there could make that fresh product available, all of a sudden this demand went through the roof, and all of a sudden you had a whole new layer of dynamics now placed upon this fish. And we've experienced it in almost every other commercially exploited fishery of a tragedy of the commons, is that, all right, here's high value, who owns it, who's regulating it? Well, I'm gonna go get my cut of it. And, you know, we've come to learn over the years is that the ocean can't necessarily replenish everything that we take out of it, especially as technology has evolved over time where it becomes easier to find them, the gear becomes stronger to catch them, that we have an advantage over their ability to kind of avoid us from what it once was. So as I mentioned, the market demand. And so immense amount of pressure globally gets placed on this fish. And I'll touch on this also in a minute, also because it is a fish without a country. It's not like the United States can say, we have jurisdiction, therefore we are protecting it, because it may only be in our waters, you know, for a few months, then it's in Canadian waters, then it's, you know, say over in the Med. And there are a number of issues when it comes to managing these sort of species, and obviously one would like to say, well, it's science, you know, so let's figure out the science, because then that'll drive management. Unfortunately, when you're dealing with that many players, politics always enters stage right, and that is truly the beast that becomes more difficult, because the same conservation ethic one country, or even user groups within one country may have, are going to differ from one country to the next country to the next country. Maybe some commercial fleets are subsidized. Maybe they don't have the same infrastructure to actually regulate fish or count how many fish their citizens are taking in every year, and then what size are those fish. And that is all data that then is fed back up into those assessments that we're all kind of trying to operate from to try to figure out. We don't want to harvest too many of these fish, but yet we still know it's a natural resource, and there's industries and recreational benefits to be had off of these fish. So how do you kind of get to those common understandings? International management. So there's a regional fishery management organization known as ICAT, the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, that started back in the 70s, that they meet annually, and there's a number of different meetings that happen throughout the year, where currently about 50 nations come together, and they have obligations as being part of this regional fishery management organization. They need to bring their data, they need to bring their scientists, they need to come with their various proposals that we can then kind of get together, and whether it's bluefin or yellowfin or big eye or swordfish or some of the sharks, that because of that migratory range, we can bring all this information to bear to help inform everyone else around the room. And again, from a science side, that all makes sense. I think everybody could be on board that you know, an informed decision is the best one. But as I mentioned earlier, sometimes not all of these players have that common good in their best interests, or they may not have the infrastructure to actually get the same quality data, so it is then comparable with their member nations to then kind of do an accurate analysis. So there's a lot of blending that comes in trying to get this correct. And that's very difficult in its own right. You know, it's just trying to get the science right. What assumptions do we make? Do we agree in those assumptions? And then the outputs of those assumptions. And that's even before politics have come into play. Is what are the strengths of the different lobbying folks in each given nation? Does a commercial fishery group have a lot of strength or the ear of their politicians and therefore pushing a certain agenda? Do, say, environmentalists have a very strong standpoint with their politicians and therefore you push that agenda? Where are folks kind of coming to the conversation from? And ultimately, how are they trying to move that conversation forward to better understanding, better management, and then a more robust resource? And then lastly, kind of in this international arena, is you can take the science, you can set the rules up, you finally get through all the politics, but then are you actually going to hold up your end of the bargain and be compliant with all those rules and regulations? Are they enforceable? Can you actually track down and find out whether or not either individuals in a fishery or a nation as a whole did what they were supposed to do? Because all of a sudden the house of cards can start to crumble very quickly if you set up this great plan, but nobody's actually adhering to it. And so there's also a significant amount of time spent in watching what everyone else is doing, as well as they're watching you to make sure that everybody's trying to be on the up and up. And if there starts to be evidence of non-compliance, how do you then smoke that out? And in that international realm, call folks to task. Now, as I mentioned earlier, kind of one of the main drivers of all of this complex regulation science is, you know, again, this tragedy of the commons, if you will, is that over time, you know, if we look, you know, across years and knowing certain events, World War II, you know, certain key pieces of technology, you know, power blocks in the fishing industry, sonar, more efficient engines, what have you, is in addition to market, you know, all of a sudden these huge catches that can take place. And if left unregulated, well, it's a free-for-all. And all of a sudden there are huge consequences biologically when that's left unchecked. And so when, you know, international management comes into play, you know, you see things kind of come around, and then as we learn more, well, then you realize that the steps you've taken haven't nearly gone far enough. So then you have to take other steps to kind of get where we think we need to be. And so following some of these fishery indicators, whether it be catch, whether it be mortality, whether it be spawning biomass, how many adults are out there that can actually replace what we're taking out of it in a fishing context, all comes into play in that international arena. And ultimately, this is kind of what it boils down to is, how many are there out there? Is it a healthy population? Whatever the resource, whether it's land management, you're talking livestock or trees, or in this context, you're talking a fishery resource, how healthy is that stock? Can you actually take fish from it and have it be replaced? Is it growing? Like if all of a sudden, especially in bluefin tuna context where they have been overfished or overfishing is occurring. Overfish is there aren't enough of them out there. Overfishing is you're taking too many out. How do you counteract some of those aspects to get back on that right track? And, you know, there's a number of assumptions, but, you know, currently for Atlantic bluefin tuna, it appears, even given some of the assumptions, that we're on the right track. There's a lot of debate that happens based upon assumptions and scientists and what goes into these stock assessment models, but generally speaking, there seems to be continued growth over the last number of years. So things kind of trending as they should or as we would hope. So trending from what takes place, say, on the international side of the house to the domestic side of the house, out of those international meetings, there are usually binding recommendations which speak to the compliance I touched on, is that thou shalt do X. Prime example is thou shalt not catch more than 100 fish, as an example. It's then kind of my office's job is then, one, to represent the United States. Two, is then kind of bring that back and saying, okay, how do we then implement this here domestically? So those fishermen that are running out of Montauk or out of Shinnecock, how do we then say, okay, we agreed as the United States to only catch 100 fish. How do we then divvy up those 100 fish to make sure that it's as fair and equitable as we can make it be? And therefore, that comes in the form of these rules and regulations. Thou shalt only catch one fish if you're a fisherman here. Thou shalt have a permit. Thou shalt report. So you start to get into that bureaucratic realm pretty quickly here domestically of, as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of more of the crowds I'm used to, who don't like that thou shalt kind of terminology. Granted, it's not that draconian, but ultimately you have a group of independent individuals that are captains of their own vessels, and he or she does not like being told what to do. So then to have Uncle Sam be that next layer above it usually makes for some colorful meetings. What then kind of happens is, okay, the rules go into play. What did they do? So you have to track that. There has to be some sort of a metric. All right, so now we're collecting information. We may be collecting information from, say, the vessels themselves. You know, how many fish did you catch? How many did you release? How many were alive? How many were dead? What type of gear did you use? How long did you fish it? Where did you fish? To maybe even data from the dealers that are, say, buying those commercial fish. Where did you send it? Did it stay here domestically or did you export it? Where did you export it to? What was the exchange rate at the time? Where did it sell for? What auction? How did it grade? What was the fat content? How oily was it? All these different things kind of come into the metrics of our own US data that we then feed back up into the machine as one of those members of that ICAT Regional Fishery Management Group to then support the science, and then the cycle continues. Is how do you then kind of take action, monitor it, and then kind of put it back into, the cycle. So on that domestic aspect is, I have my office up in Gloucester, Massachusetts, actually. These windows right here. Very accessible if anybody ever wanted to come and harass me. They can actually look and see if I'm home. But we, I've been doing this close to 18 years now, and it's because you get to wear a number of different hats. Like I mentioned earlier, you get to work with scientists from around the globe. You get to work with folks from different countries. You get to work with folks that deal more with just the bureaucracy of things, to interested fishermen, to conservationists, to members of Joe and Jane Public that just really genuinely have an interest that these fish are out there, to everybody that also thinks that wicked tuna is real. You will run the full gamut of folks that have an interest. And our main objectives are to make sure, that we're not over-harvesting this resource, that we're providing fishing opportunities, and that we're constantly kind of rebuilding, or shall I say, assisting in rebuilding. So again, these resources are here for years to come. And that comes along with a lot of different of the operations that I have as a bureaucrat. It's how do you monitor the vessels? All right, you permit them. What kind of activities are they doing? Are they commercial? Are they recreational? Are they charter folks? What kind of gears are they using? Tracking the dealers. This will actually come up in a slide to show actually how complex tracking a fish can actually be. And there's immense amount of dollars spent domestically as well as internationally to track just this species. And there's lots of interest of how do you then support traceability, whether it's on a governmental side, whether it's on a market side, it's growing more and more in strength of how do you know what's on your dinner plate, where it came from, how it was harvested, and was it done sustainably, and how important that can be to then influence the rest of the system. So taking it somewhat more locally here, this is my backyard. This is the jurisdiction that I currently have the authority over. So it's anywhere along the Atlantic seaboard, the Gulf of Mexico, the Bahamas, as well as international waters. And so up here in New England in the Northeast, there is a lot of fishing that takes place both among New York, and I actually do a lot of fishing out of the other end of Long Island, out of Jones Inlet, with a number of friends, and kind of seeing a lot of what Chris had mentioned earlier. What are these wonderful resources that are here off of Long Island? So underneath that jurisdiction is then the domestic management of things, of trying to figure out the who, what, when, where, whys, and hows. And there's a huge diversity, even here domestically, of, say, your recreational fishermen that can have anywhere from a 19-foot boat up to a 70-foot yacht that are going out there purely for the enjoyment of chasing these fish down. You could then deal with, say, more of the commercial fishermen that are pursuing these larger fish to support that, that demand on the sushi and the sashimi market, to, say, more industrial size fishing, seine nets that are, circling entire schools, all the way down to the kind of very primitive harpoon fishing, where there's about 20 vessels, most of them up in New England, that still actually harvest this, where they are out on the pulpit in front of a boat throwing a harpoon at a free swimming fish. And that's actually how they're pursuing this resource. Unbelievably skillful. They need all the different stars to come into alignment, weather conditions wise, but the quality of the fish, when you're taking it that one at a time and you're actually looking at it, demands a high dollar product, actually. So this, just because I am a bureaucrat, I have to throw lots of bullets up and acronyms, and it's just in my nature. But some of the complexities, whether it's you're looking at the user group like in this previous slide, and this is just domestic users. This isn't, say, folks that just want to conserve the resource or members. This is just, say, on the fishing side. But then that same level of complexity exists internal to the agency. You have multiple partners that you then have to collaborate with, make sure channels of communication are open so that the right hand knows what the left hand is doing. And just like in any sort of organization, well, that can just be a flat-out pain in the ass. Because folks don't necessarily speak the same language, the priorities aren't the same, and so needing to, say, track vessels or dealers and who they're reporting to, or are they only participating in one fishery or multiple fisheries, and how do you tease that out? Where's their income being driven from? All become questions that we're constantly chasing down to better refine our understanding of what's actually transpiring, not only in the environment of the fish themselves, but in the environment of the fishery itself as well, that human component. And so sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, you look at landings and, what are the impacts we have as domestic users and the various groups. For instance, these green bars, are just representative of our commercial hand gear catch. These are your wicked tuna guys going out with rod and reel, catching these fish, returning same day, and then selling those fish on the domestic market versus, say, some of our recreational harvest, which varies over time, or some of our long line bycatch. These are industrial fleets that I think we've heard about that have a number of issues that go along with them. As far as bycatch of some of the turtles or marine mammals or seabirds, in addition to the tunas and the swordfish that they're pursuing. So we kind of keep tracking this on a regular basis to kind of see what's transpiring in these various domestic fleets so we can then in turn adjust accordingly. When it comes to, say, some of the data that we tease out from some of our recreational fisheries, again, there's usually a lot more recreational fishermen than there are commercial fishermen. You can then start to track trends that may start to appear that then help influence us of how do we set rules up for the next year to, again, stay on that right trajectory. So here we have a compilation of all the various states, kind of North Carolina north, that encounter bluefin tuna in their fisheries, and they're spread out across time, 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and then it's the length of the fish. And so sometimes, we'll see different patterns, but also we'll also start to see some patterns emerge where there may be a particularly strong year class of these fish that are moving through. So in 2014, they were 35 inches in length. And, they were pretty well caught in, say, New Jersey, New York, and, to a lesser degree off Delaware. Okay, then what happened the next year? Okay, well, a couple inches, usually the same body of fish, but they've grown to some degree. Where are they being caught? And we can start to track these trends down. So let's say we had a liberal limit that recreational fishermen could harvest here. Let's say it was 1 fish per person. Well, as these fish grow, they also become heavier. And as these catches become more publicized, well, then usually there are more fishermen that kind of come to the situation. So then effort goes up. So then this helps us make decisions on, well, maybe instead of 1 fish per person, maybe it's 1 fish a boat, or maybe it's 2 fish a boat, to kind of keep things in check, the amount of pressure we can put on these resources. And sometimes we can do this real time. But just to keep track of these trends again, so we're not always kind of shaking up that magic 8 ball and being like, did we get it right? Oh shit, try again. That's usually not a good way to be a steward of a natural resource, and especially something that is this valuable and this high profile. So this, I mentioned this earlier. So there I had an example of how do we track some of the recreational catch. Well, here's how do you track some of the international catch. And here is a live fire example that happened back in 2006 or so of a fish that we actually had tracked all the way through. And so you have to bear with me here. So starting with block 1 here, we actually had a French vessel catch an eastern bluefin tuna in a purseine net and put that fish into a holding pen that was owned by Turkey. That fish was then harvested by Turkey and then shipped to Italy. At which point from Italy, it was then shipped to the United States. From the United States, it went from East Coast to West Coast, from West Coast to Japan, and then in Japan, that fish was actually split, and at some point in time, a frozen piece of it came back to Canada. Whew. So this is known as the heartburn and headache example. Because as part of some of those international agreements we have, and making sure that you could police everyone, it is to kind of know that where did this fish come from, and ultimately where did it go? And so you should be able to have an apple-to-apple comparison at the end of the day. Great academic exercise until some of the realities of the marketplace come into play, and then trying to figure out, even if, say, this happens across 2 or 3 years, how are you then tracking these fish down? And so it becomes unbelievably complex. But yet, unfortunately, that's where we've found ourselves given some of these pressures that we've experienced. And so again, just one of those examples of what can be involved when you actually sit down, say, at a sushi bar, and you've ordered up that toro, that, that fish may have had a journey like this, not to mention the carbon footprint and everything else that may come along with this sort of an example. Shifting gears slightly, so with that complexity, sometimes what it allows for is innovation to come address some of these issues that we have that are struggling with. So as I mentioned earlier, that longline fishery that has a history of having a fair amount of bycatch with it, species they're not trying to catch, but just happens to be caught, given the length of the gear and how that gear is, that I implemented a rule 2 years ago that actually required them to actually have cameras on board. So you can actually see now, with relative certainty, what they're catching. Obviously, weather conditions come into play, but you can now then track how many turtles are they interacting with, how many swordfish, how many sharks, how many bluefin, are they keeping them, are they sending them back, which then, again, refines the data we're collecting. Or one other project we worked on in the Gulf of Mexico was that primarily they're trying to catch yellowfin that are about this big. The bluefin tuna are usually 600, 700, 800,000 pounds in the Gulf of Mexico. So how do you minimize that bycatch? Well, one is you take the same hook, but you make it out of a thinner wire diameter. So when the yellowfin takes that hook, it stays on it. But when you have a bluefin twice the size of it, it'll then straighten out. Just different ways to bring, say, engineers versus just fish geeks to help troubleshoot some of these issues. And then this I just kind of threw in because this has gotten a fair amount of press as of late, was that it's not all kind of within the fisheries realm. Sometimes the President of the United States steps in and says, well, we're going to do some protections here. And recently the Northeast Canyon Seamount, which, if you are, say, coming out of Montauk or Rhode Island, and I've fished some of these areas before, and they're a pretty common area for recreational fishing, that these areas were protected. They were declared a monument. Therefore, there shall be no commercial extraction unless there's a group that's exempted from it. A completely different set of politics, different legislation, what have you, to again, trying to set up these marine protected areas to get at some of the issues I've touched on, whether it's bycatch, providing habitat protection, what have you, but yet also comes along with all the political outfall as well of this isn't necessarily as transparent as a process as the meetings I mentioned when I first jumped up on stage. So I know it was kind of more of a shotgun approach there, but I think we may have a little time for a question or two. If not, I'll be around to talk with folks in the margins as well. Thank you.
We do have time for a couple questions.
Hi, Dave DeRitter. Two-part question. Do you know the reproductive maturity for the bluefin? And are there specific regulations that you tie in with the reproductive cycle for the fish to ensure the, that you don't do overfishing?
Sure. So the age or size of maturity is highly contested. It's pretty well documented in the Mediterranean and the Eastern Atlantic. It's the age of, say, 4 or 5 years of age, where in the Western Atlantic, the fish, say, that are spawned in the Gulf of Mexico, it's assumed to be much older. But there's conflicting evidence where all of a sudden scientists say may come across a fish where the gonads are right. And so, but it's a smaller size fish. And maybe it was caught, say, in the mud hole off of Montauk. So how do you then explain those sort of data anomalies that may pop up? And then it starts to feed into other questions is, well, was that a Mediterranean fish that came here? Is there a spawning area that we don't know about? Or is there some gray area in between? So there isn't a kind of locked in age of maturity currently for, say, the Western Atlantic fish right now. We still kind of run with the assumption it's more like 8, 9, 10 years, kind of in that. As far as the rules and regulations, we do set it up that we kind of put more of the commercial pressure on those larger size classes, so those fish have had an opportunity to spawn. Recreationally, we kind of allow harvest of more of those juvenile fish, but again, we kind of regulate that more is because it's the experience versus those fish are going to market and having the dollar driven, although there are ripple effects in the market.
Okay, one last real quick question, and John was here first.
Just a quick question. You had indicated that, again, the Gulf of Mexico is a key sporting site. I'm just curious about what your thoughts were about the Deepwater Horizon blowout and how that might have affected the stock there in spawning.
We were definitely involved there. And there are a number of different studies to show some of the potential interactions there. It didn't seem to have that significant of an impact on, say, the adult fish that were there. They migrated out of the area for the most part, but the larval impacts of especially not only the oil, but the dispersants that were used was also a huge impact And the results are still trying to be assessed. There are some theories that it could have impacted, say, 5% of the population of those larvae coming through, but it's still kind of an unknown. It did have an impact, but to what order of magnitude is still kind of being assessed.